Now, maybe on this question of looking beyond the BRICS, I mean, I have two cases that I wanted to ask you about. The first one would be Iran. Now, with Iran, here we have a major oil producer, important trade partner for India in particular, but also for China with oil. And we now have this regime of U.S. sanctions, unilateral sanctions. We have the secondary boycott built in. If you deal with the Iranian central bank, then you're going to be cut off, and the U.S. will boycott anybody who deals with you. It would seem to me that Iran would be some kind of a candidate to converge in some way with the BRICS, if only because they've really been forced out of the IMF World Bank system and are sort of free-floating.
Yeah. I think, look back at Cuba. I mean, 50 years of sanctions, what have they done? They have not managed to achieve any of the strategic objectives of the United States. Castros are still ruling the country and still a very much legitimate entity. So I think, the world is too large and it's no longer unipolar for United States to squeeze a country out and isolate it to the point where it, just gives up and falls on its knees. I think that is over, and Iran has options. Iran has options with BRICS countries, and Iran has, of course, also options in the Middle East itself. I think a state like Iran is necessary for stabilizing that whole region, and I think it's actually a strategic mistake on the part of the United States. If they're already out of Iraq, and if they're contemplating a speedy withdrawal from Afghanistan, Iran will be necessary to curb and to control Sunni fundamentalism in the region. And I think India shares that interest along with Iran, and therefore there is no question of India bowing to any Western pressure. And in fact, the West itself will be better off not trying to pressurize India on this matter, because India performs very many important functions in Asia that the West itself would prefer. And therefore, it would be, I've said elsewhere, that it would be a strategic suicide if the West really tries to turn the screws too much on India on this question of Iran. So Iran will be critical. I think there are others. I mean, in Southeast Asia, Indonesia is growing at a fast clip and is being mentioned as one of the new emerging economies. And so there will be other players. That's why I said BRICS is fluid. BRICS has to do with high levels of growth among these 5 countries over the last decade, but they will be joined by others. So I think it is going to be, it's not a permanent institution. Rather, it's something that you will have BRICS Plus very soon. My own feeling is in the next 5 years, you will have a BRICS Plus group that may expand to 10 or 15 fast-growing economies which find it useful to form their own institutions rather than to depend on the old structure, because the old structure is premised on supporting unipolarity. And unipolarity is not what the emerging economies want. So there's a fundamental contradiction. The World Bank and the IMF, are premised upon preserving American hegemony, and that's not acceptable to most of these emerging economies.
Quite right. We'll be right back with another segment. We have a little bit longer pause this time, but please stay with us, and we'll be back with Dr. Sreeram Chaulia in India on World Crisis Radio. Some people have seen in him a future foreign minister of India, but the time will tell. Let me just ask you, Dr. Chaulia. We talked about Iran, a country that is also, I think, immediately under the gun of the International Monetary Fund would be Egypt. And you were talking about BRICS as something that's in the process of developing. Obviously, one of the things you'd want to have is somebody in the Arab world. Egypt right now is being forced to accept the IMF conditionalities for a loan of $3.2 billion on the way to borrowing 11 or 12 billion. And I wonder if there's any sense of urgency in the meeting there about beginning to offer alternatives for huge important countries that need an alternative and that sort of need it in the here and now.
Oh, well, I think it's great advice. Egypt, has culturally and historically been the epicenter of the Arab world. And I think it will, given that it is in a delicate transition stage, and given that the U.S. military aid to Egypt has been one of the underpinnings of a conservative order in the entire Middle East. I think this pressure on Egypt now to take IMF money is part of this attempt to ensure that the transition goes the way the West wants it to go, rather than in its own indigenous way, as per the wishes of the Egyptian people. So I think these forces, the ones who want to ensure that the military continues to be a prominent decision maker in Egypt, are the ones who are going to use aid as a strategy to keep strengthening the Egyptian military, which will ensure that it's a fourth de facto, if not de jure, dictatorship, which is under military control since Nasser's time. So we will have to the BRICS states, all of them, many of them, as you know, are dependent. I mean, especially China and India are dependent on the Middle East for their oil supplies, and they will need to also play a role in this region for their own energy security, and also, as you said, for expanding their worth in a crucial part of the world. So Egypt, I think, the problem with the BRICS states is that they have not looked at the Middle East from the lenses of expanding their influence in the world. Rather, they have looked at it in a piecemeal manner. There have been differences among BRICS states, and as you said at the introduction, that has been widely publicized in the West to show that there's a lot of disunity among BRICS states. Because on Syria especially, Russia and China have been on one side, while Brazil, South Africa, and India have been on the other side. So I think it is important to close ranks and to show that they have a purposeful vision for the Middle East and for the future of the Arab Spring. Everybody knows, and most of all the Egyptian people know, that when Mubarak, was counting his last hours, the United States was desperately trying to save him. So everybody knows what the agenda of the United States is now in Egypt. So I think it will be important for BRICS to come up with an alternative agenda, which is to support the Egyptian people to find their own path. And institutions in critical hotspots like Egypt, for example, today will be subject to being swayed one way or the other. It's in many ways like a reprise of the Cold War, except that it's not so ideologically stark. And therefore, I think BRICS will need to come up with their own proposals and ideas to shape these institutions in these hotspots in particular directions that will counter the Western one. But of course, there are, as I said, complications and differences among BRICS states. So they will, in fact, the politics, the vision about which way the world is going, which way the Middle East is going, is not unified yet among BRICS. But I think as they get more and more frustrated by their inability to make inroads into the old system of the Bretton Woods, I think they will increasingly become radicalized. That is their only option. And by radicalized, I mean they will have to forge common positions on political questions so that they do not just give away many regions of the world on a platter, but rather create conditions where these regions are able to stand up against any form of neocolonial hegemony. So
okay. Maybe one
this is the vision of Chavez, as you know, in Venezuela, and I think these kind of allies will eventually make BRICS much stronger.
Right. Let me just ask you one final question now. This is about the blowback, the countermeasures. We know that the imperialists, for want of a better word, fight dirty. I can remember the Colombo, Sri Lanka conference of August 1975. I think 88 non-aligned countries. They demanded a new universal finance and currency system. They demanded debt relief for the poorest countries, new credit creation, technology transfer, triangular trade. And the result of this was then a big counteroffensive Indira Gandhi had supported it. She, of course, was assassinated. Mrs. Bandaranaike was driven from office. The Italian government that had been interested in this, Andreotti Forlani, they were hit then by the Moro kidnap and assassination, similar things. Is there any awareness that the imperialist centers will really stop at nothing in attempting to prevent the kinds of peaceful, rational development that you've been talking about?
Webster, the world has changed so much. I don't think they can sabotage or do assassinations and coups and proxy wars like they did during the Cold War days. I don't think they can harm BRIC states because, one, the world has changed in the sense that the awareness of these kind of manipulations and subterfuge is much greater. And two, there is an inherent anti-colonial tendency in I see in all the BRICS countries, and so it's not possible for them to just play one off against the other, or to, as you said, do dirty wars or resort to physical violence. I think the costs are too high. I mean, if you look at China today, I don't think the Americans, even if they wished, have the means to really destabilize that country. It is going along with a will of its own and has enough resources to resist these kind of covert interventions. So I think I'm pretty confident that this is what Kishore Mahbubani of Singapore calls the irreversible shift of power from west to east, and hopefully from north to south also. So that's irresistible. And I don't think counter-revolutionary tactics are going to upset this apple cart very much. In fact, it's not possible anymore simply because power is much more widely distributed today than it was in the 70s. And power is now in multiple centers, and it's not possible to just jam down all the lines and say that now, we are the only game in town. I think there are multiple centers with multiple projections of power happening in different corners. And it is simply impossible for the United States, that is in such deep economic crisis, or Europe or Western Europe, to be able to play their own games. I mean, they have unfortunately played the game in Libya last year, and that is where the BRICS lost the plot. I felt that that is where we could have been far more united and decisive in preventing this kind of neocolonial intervention in the name of human rights and so on. But in the future, I think people are wiser now after Libya. I don't think we're going to see more Kosovos or more Libyas with no UN sanctions, so-called coalitions of the willing doing terrible damage.
All right, thank you very much. That was Professor Chaulia of the Jindal School.